The diner fell silent as 8 Navy SEALs in full dress uniform walked through the door. Every eye followed them as they moved with military precision toward the corner booth where Sarah had been serving coffee and pie for the past 3 years. The youngest customers whispered nervously. SEALs didn't just show up at Mabel's diner in small-town Nebraska for no reason. Sarah's hands trembled as she approached their table, coffee pot in hand, completely unaware that her carefully guarded secret was about to be revealed. What happened next would shock everyone in that diner and change how an entire town viewed the quiet woman they thought they knew. Because sometimes the most extraordinary heroes hide in the most ordinary places. The morning sun filtered through the grease-stained windows of Mabel's diner, casting long shadows across the checkered linoleum floor. Sarah Martinez moved between the tables with practiced efficiency, her worn sneakers silent against the tiles as she refilled coffee cups and cleared plates. To the regulars who'd been coming here for years, she was simply part of the furniture, reliable as the sunrise, quiet as a church mouse, and forgettable as yesterday's newspaper. Old Pete at table 3 barely looked up from his crossword when she topped off his black coffee. The construction crew at the counter continued their loud debate about the local football team, his chances this season. Margaret from the bank offered her usual tight smile and went back to scrolling through her phone. Nobody really saw Sarah Martinez. They saw a waitress, nothing more. But if they'd looked closer, really looked, they might have noticed things that didn't quite fit the small-town diner waitress narrative. The way she held herself with perfect posture even after 8-hour shifts. How her eyes automatically swept the room when she entered, cataloging exits and potential threats with military precision. The fact that she never flinched when the coffee machine's steam release sounded like hydraulics on heavy machinery. Her movements were too controlled, too purposeful for someone who'd spent their whole life slinging hash and pouring coffee. There was something almost martial about the way she carried herself, a bearing that spoke of discipline and training that went far beyond learning to balance plates on her arm. Sarah had worked at Mabel's for 3 years now, ever since she'd drifted into this forgotten corner of Nebraska like tumbleweeds after a storm. She'd answered Mabel's help wanted ad with cash for the security deposit on her tiny apartment above the hardware store, and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Mabel, pushing 70 and tired of working 7 days a week, had hired her on the spot. Sarah was punctual, hardworking, and best of all, she didn't ask for much and didn't share much either. In a town where everyone knew everyone else's business going back 3 generations, Sarah Martinez was refreshingly anonymous. She worked her shifts, paid her bills, and kept to herself. Perfect employee material for a woman who just wanted to run her diner in peace. The breakfast rush was winding down when the news came on the old television mounted in the corner. Sarah was wiping down table 6 when the anchor's voice cut through the diner's morning chatter, with a story about military operations overseas. Her cloth stilled against the formica surface as images of helicopters filled the screen, their rotors churning through desert dust. For just a moment, something flickered across her face. Pain, longing, maybe even fear. Her knuckles whitened around the cleaning rag as the reporter discussed casualty numbers and rescue operations. Then Pete called for more coffee, snapping her back to the present, and the moment passed. She folded the cloth neatly, tucked a strand of dark hair behind her ear, and returned to work. But for those few seconds, anyone watching closely might have seen something else entirely in Sarah Martinez. Something that suggested the quiet waitress had stories to tell, if anyone had bothered to ask. Stories about the thunder of rotor blades and the weight of lives hanging in the balance. Stories about courage under fire and split-second decisions that meant the difference between heroes coming home or families receiving folded flags. But nobody was watching that closely. Nobody ever was. Lieutenant Sarah Martinez had been 26 when she first climbed into the cockpit of a Navy SH-60 Seahawk, the rhythmic thump of the rotors matching the steady beat of her heart. Flying had always been in her blood, but military aviation was something else entirely. Precision under pressure, life and death decisions made in milliseconds, and the absolute trust between pilot and crew that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophe. She'd graduated top of her flight school class, earned her wings with distinction, and quickly gained a reputation as one of the most skilled rescue pilots in her squadron. Her call sign was steady, earned after a particularly harrowing mission where she'd held a damaged helicopter in hover for 43 minutes, while her crew extracted wounded Marines from a hot landing zone. Other pilots might have panicked or pulled back, but Sarah Martinez had nerves of steel and hands that never shook, no matter how intense the situation became. For 8 years, she'd flown missions that most people only saw in movies. Combat search and rescue operations deep in hostile territory, medical evacuations from forward operating bases under enemy fire, and insertion missions that required threading her aircraft through mountain valleys at night, with no margin for error. Her crew trusted her completely, knowing that when Lieutenant Martinez was at the controls, they were coming home. She'd saved 247 lives during her career, a number she could recite precisely because each rescue was burned into her memory. The terrified faces of wounded soldiers as they were pulled aboard her aircraft. The relief in a mother's voice over the radio when told her son was safe. The weight of responsibility that came with holding other people's lives in her hands every time she lifted off. Sarah had thrived under that pressure, found purpose in the chaos, and discovered that she was capable of courage she'd never known she possessed. But military service exacts a toll that doesn't always show on the outside. The hypervigilance that kept her crew alive in combat zones made it hard to relax in peaceful moments. The split-second decision-making that saved lives in emergencies made everyday choices feel impossibly trivial. The adrenaline highs of successful missions were followed by crushing lows when she couldn't save everyone. Sarah started having nightmares about crashes that never happened, waking up in cold sweats from dreams where her hands froze on the controls and her crew died because she failed them. The flight surgeon noticed her increased anxiety levels during routine physicals. Her squadron commander saw the way she pushed herself harder than anyone else, taking on extra missions and refusing leave time that might have helped her recover. Everyone could see she was burning out, but Sarah Martinez had never learned how to quit anything in her life. The end came on a routine medical evacuation mission over the mountains of Afghanistan. Engine failure at low altitude with nowhere to auto-rotate. Sarah had fought her damaged aircraft for every second of controlled flight, while her crew prepared for a hard landing. She'd managed to put the helicopter down in the only clear space available, a rocky outcrop barely large enough for the aircraft's footprint. Everyone survived, including the wounded soldier they were evacuating, but Sarah's back was shattered in 3 places during the impact. 6 months of surgeries and rehabilitation followed, with doctors telling her she'd never fly again. The Navy offered her a medical discharge with full honors, a pension, and the thanks of a grateful nation. But for someone whose identity had been built around flying, around saving lives and serving her country, medical retirement felt like death by 1,000 cuts. Sarah Martinez, the pilot who'd never met a mission she couldn't complete, had finally found something she couldn't overcome. So she'd taken her discharge papers, her medical pension, and her damaged spine, and disappeared into the anonymity of civilian life, hoping that somewhere in America's heartland, she might find a way to forget who she used to be. The black SUV pulled into Mabel's parking lot at exactly 11:30 on a Tuesday morning, its tinted windows and government plates immediately drawing curious glances from the handful of customers inside. Sarah was refilling the sugar dispensers when she noticed the vehicle through the window, and something cold settled in her stomach. Government vehicles didn't come to places like this unless someone was in trouble or someone needed to be found. She watched as 8 men in Navy dress blue uniforms emerged from the vehicle, their movements coordinated and purposeful in a way that spoke of extensive training and shared experience. Even through the diner's smudged glass, she could see the distinctive seal trident pins on their chests, the kind of insignia that marked them as members of the most elite fighting force in the world. Her hands began to shake as the implications hit her. Navy SEALs didn't travel in dress uniform to small Nebraska towns for social calls. The diner's bell chimed as they entered in single file, their polished shoes clicking against the linoleum with military precision. Conversation died as every head turned to stare at the newcomers. Pete's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. Margaret from the bank looked up from her phone with wide eyes. Even Mabel emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron as she took in the sight of 8 Navy SEALs standing in her modest establishment. The team leader, a tall man with graying temples and the bearing of someone accustomed to command, scanned the room until his eyes locked onto Sarah. She felt her breath catch in her throat as recognition flickered across his face, followed by something that looked like relief. Behind the counter, she gripped the sugar dispenser so tightly her knuckles went white, fighting every instinct that told her to run. "Ma'am," the team leader said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made people listen without question. "We're looking for former Lieutenant Sarah Martinez, United States Navy." The silence in the diner became absolute. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears as every eye in the place turned toward her. Pete's mouth fell open in surprise. Margaret's phone clattered forgotten onto her table. Even the cook had stopped moving in the kitchen, creating a stillness that felt almost sacred. Sarah stood frozen behind the counter, still clutching the sugar dispenser, as her carefully constructed civilian identity crumbled around her. For 3 years, she'd been nobody special. Just Sarah the waitress who poured good coffee and remembered how everyone liked their eggs. Now these men had walked into her sanctuary and spoken her real name aloud, the name that came with a history she'd tried so hard to leave behind. The team leader took a step forward, his expression gentle despite the formal nature of his mission. "Lieutenant Martinez, my name is Master Chief Petty Officer James Sullivan. These are members of SEAL Team 7. He gestured to the men flanking him, each one standing at attention with the kind of discipline that comes from years of elite military training. "We've been looking for you for quite some time, ma'am. We have something that belongs to you, and a story that needs to be told." Sarah's legs felt weak as the weight of her past settled back onto her shoulders. She'd known this day might come eventually. You couldn't disappear completely from the military's institutional memory, especially when you'd served with distinction. But she'd hoped for more time, more anonymity, more distance from the person she used to be. The other customers were staring openly now, trying to reconcile the quiet waitress they thought they knew with the military officer these elite warriors had come to find. Mabel stepped forward protectively, as if she could somehow shield her employee from whatever was about to happen. But Sarah knew there was no hiding anymore. After 3 years of silence, her past had finally caught up with her in the most public way possible. Master Chief Sullivan reached into his dress uniform jacket and withdrew a small wooden box, the kind used for military decorations. His hands were steady as he opened it, revealing the distinctive star and ribbon of the Silver Star medal nestled in blue velvet. "Lieutenant Martinez," he said, his voice carrying across the silent diner with ceremonial gravity, "on behalf of the United States Navy and the men of SEAL Team 7, I have the honor of presenting you with the Silver Star for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against an enemy of the United States." The medal caught the diner's fluorescent lights as he held it up, its silver surface gleaming like a promise finally kept. Sarah's eyes filled with tears she'd held back for years as the Master Chief continued. "This decoration was approved for your actions during Operation Neptune Shield, but you'd already separated from service before the paperwork was completed. It's taken us 3 years to track you down." The story spilled out then, told in the clear, measured tones of a military briefing, but heavy with emotion that no amount of training could completely suppress. 5 years ago, during Sarah's final months of active duty, her helicopter had been scrambled for an emergency extraction mission. A SEAL reconnaissance team had been compromised deep in enemy territory, surrounded and taking heavy fire with one critically wounded operator who couldn't be moved. The landing zone was smaller than a basketball court, ringed by hostile forces with zero margin for error. 3 other pilots had declared the mission impossible due to the tactical situation and mountainous terrain. But Lieutenant Sarah Martinez had studied the reconnaissance photos for exactly 17 minutes, calculated wind patterns and approach angles, and announced she was going in. Her crew had protested. It was a suicide mission, they said. But Sarah had simply strapped in, started the engines, and flown into hell to bring those men home. "Petty Officer Marcus Chen," Master Chief Sullivan said, gesturing to one of the SEALs behind him, "was the wounded operator that night. The doctor said he had maybe 10 minutes left when Lieutenant Martinez set her bird down in that impossible landing zone." Chen stepped forward, his own eyes bright with unshed tears as he looked at the woman who'd saved his life. "Ma'am, I've got 2 kids now because of what you did that night. My daughter just turned 4, and my son started kindergarten last month. They exist because you refused to leave a man behind. Sarah's composure finally cracked as the full weight of the moment hit her. She'd spent 3 years believing her military career had ended in failure, that her injuries had made her useless, that her service had been forgotten. But these men had traveled halfway across the country to tell her that everything she'd sacrificed had meant something, that the lives she'd saved were living proof of her valor. The presentation ceremony continued with military precision as each member of the team shared how Sarah's actions had impacted their brotherhood. The wounded operator she'd extracted had gone on to save dozens of other lives in subsequent missions. The intelligence his team had gathered during that operation had prevented a major terrorist attack on American soil. The ripple effects of her courage that night had spread far beyond what she could have imagined. As Master Chief Sullivan pinned the Silver Star to her diner uniform, the other customers began to understand what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a military ceremony. It was the recognition of genuine heroism that had been hiding in plain sight among them for 3 years. Pete stood up and began clapping, followed by Margaret, then Mabel, until the entire diner erupted in applause for their quiet waitress, who turned out to be anything but ordinary. Sarah wiped her tears and looked around the room at the faces of people she'd served coffee to for 3 years, seeing respect and admiration where there had once been casual indifference. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice stronger than it had been in years. "All of you. For giving me a place to heal, for treating me like family, for helping me remember that service comes in many forms." She touched the medal on her chest, feeling its weight not as a burden but as a reminder of who she really was. The quiet waitress and the decorated pilot weren't separate people. They were both Sarah Martinez, both valuable, both worthy of respect. As the SEALs prepared to leave, Master Chief Sullivan shook her hand one final time. "Once a warrior, always a warrior, Lieutenant. Thank you for your service." And for the first time in 3 years, Sarah Martinez stood a little straighter, knowing that some honors are worth waiting for, and some heroes are exactly where they need to be. In diners and cafes across America, in grocery stores and mechanic shops, in classrooms and offices everywhere, there are heroes hiding in plain sight. They're the quiet ones who've seen things most of us can only imagine, who've made sacrifices we'll never fully understand, and who've chosen to continue serving in whatever way they can. Sarah Martinez's story reminds us that heroism doesn't always wear a uniform, and that sometimes the most extraordinary people are the ones who seem the most ordinary. Every veteran carries stories of courage, sacrifice, and brotherhood that deserve our recognition and respect. They've earned the right to live quiet lives if they choose, but they've also earned our gratitude for the service that made those quiet lives possible. The next time you encounter someone in your daily routine, your waitress, your mechanic, your neighbor, remember that you might be in the presence of greatness that simply chooses not to announce itself. If Sarah's story has moved you, honor the veterans in your own community by taking a moment to say thank you. Subscribe to hear more stories of American heroes, and remember that freedom is not free. It's paid for by people willing to risk everything so the rest of us can sleep safely at night. Because in the end, we're all stronger when we recognize the heroes among us, even when they're wearing aprons instead of uniforms.